Good evening, everyone, and welcome to COS at Home. I am your host, Jonathan Viaud, and thank you so much for joining us for another exciting program. Tonight, we have some really exciting developments to share with you during our COS Now segment. A lot of good, positive news for Convention of States that I'm excited to share with you. We also are going to remind you of an important and super easy action that you can take tonight from the comfort of your own home to help us advance our COS mission. For our interview segment of the program, we are excited to introduce many of you to a new COS supporter, host of the Speakeasy podcast, and author of Confessions of a Crappy Christian, Blake Guichet. Blake recently hosted Mark Meckler on her program in March, and she's become a supporter of Convention of States, so we're excited to return the favor and welcome her to COS at Home. For anyone that is new to the show and organization, I'd like to take a minute to welcome you to Convention of States and to COS at Home. We're a grassroots movement focused on the goal of utilizing Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution to call a convention proposing amendments to the Constitution that would reduce the size and scope of the federal government, impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, and place term limits on all members of Congress and federal officials. That's an important part that sometimes people overlook. Federal officials, we're talking about bureaucrats. We don't want to see any more Anthony Fauci's of the world, right? So we'd put term limits on them. In order to hold this convention, we need 34 states to pass our resolution. And as of right now, 19 states have done so. So that is our goal. But what is our mission at Convention of States? Well, we have a saying around here that is self-governance is more than a convention. That's right. Convention of States, we are more than a convention. Our mission is to build the largest engaged army of self-governing grassroots activists in American history, or the way I like to put it is to reestablish a culture of self-governance. Our founders built a system of governance that was dependent on an active and educated citizenry. Sadly, we Americans have allowed the comfort and distractions of everyday life to prevent us from doing our duty. Convention of States is focused on changing that and reigniting the fire of liberty in every American citizen. We hope that you will join us. All right, now let's go ahead and get started with 5 for 5. Okay, so just as a reminder of what this segment is all about, we take 5 minutes to talk about Article 5 or Convention of States to give you a little bit more of a background or better understanding of what it is that we're trying to accomplish. So tonight for 5 for 5, we're bringing your attention back to something that we talked about a couple months ago on the program, the Article 5 Solution Series. We first aired this series back in the fall, and they are impactful, succinct video versions of essays written by Article 5 scholars. The series we selected, or the episode of the series that we selected for tonight, is Demystifying a Dusty Stool. Wow. Demystifying a Dusty Tool, written by COS Senior Vice President of Legislative Affairs, Rita Peters.
The Article 5 Solution, Demystifying a Dusty Tool, written by Rita Peters, Esquire, National Legislative Strategist for Convention of States Action. Perhaps the most unifying conservative trait is the conviction that our founding fathers designed an ingenious federal system that we ought to conserve. But as federalism lies dying and our society spirals towards socialism, there is dissension among conservatives about using the procedure the founders left to the states to conserve it. Because Article 5's amendment proposing convention process has never been used, some have branded it a mystical and dangerous power, a thing shrouded in mystery, riddled with unanswerable questions, and therefore best left alone. Some have literally labeled it a, quote, Pandora's box, unquote, the opening of which would unleash all manner of evil upon our beleaguered nation. Article 5 opponents accuse proponents of being reckless with the Constitution. They say we have no idea how a convention would work, who would choose the delegates, how votes would be apportioned, or whether the topic of amendments could be limited. My task today is to remove the shroud of mysticism by revealing what we do know about an Article 5 convention from its text, context, historical precedent, and simple logic. For starters, we know that the founders' whole purpose for including the convention mechanism was to provide a way for the states to bypass Congress in achieving needed constitutional amendments. An early draft of Article 5 vested Congress with the sole power to propose constitutional amendments. Under that version, 2/3 of the states could petition Congress to propose amendments, but it was still Congress that did the proposing. On September 15, 1787, George Mason strenuously objected to this, pointing out that such a system provided no recourse for the states if the national government should become tyrannical, as he predicted it would do. The result was the unanimous adoption of Article 5 in its current form, providing two ways for constitutional amendments to be proposed. Congress can propose them, or the states can propose amendments at a convention called by Congress upon application from 2/3 or 34 of the states. Regardless of which body proposes the amendments, proposals must be ratified by 3/4 or 38 of the states in order to become effective. We also know from history that voting at an Article 5 convention would be done on a one-state, one-vote basis. This is the universal precedent set by the 32 interstate conventions that occurred prior to the Constitution's drafting. It explains why it was unnecessary for Article 5 to specify the number of delegates to be sent by each state. The states can send as many delegates as they like, but each state only gets one vote. We know that state legislatures choose and instruct their convention delegates who act as agents of the state legislatures. Again, this is a matter of universal historical precedent for interstate conventions. On November 14, 1788, the Virginia General Assembly filed the very first application for an Article 5 convention to propose a Bill of Rights, aptly branding the convention, quote, a convention of the states, unquote, to be composed of, quote, deputies from the several states, unquote. Because Congress ultimately used its own Article 5 power to propose a Bill of Rights, that meeting was rendered unnecessary. But the application demonstrates the contemporaneous understanding that the convention process was state-led. The Supreme Court has likewise referred to the process as a, quote, convention of states, unquote. Finally, we know that the topic specified in the convention applications does matter. Over 400 applications for an Article 5 convention have been filed since the drafting of the Constitution. The reason we have never had one is because there have never been 34 applications seeking a convention for the same purpose. The state applications contain the agenda for an Article 5 convention, and until 34 states agree upon a convention agenda, there will be no convention. Because the authority of an Article 5 convention is derived from the 34 state applications that trigger it, the topic for amendments specified in those applications is a binding limitation on the scope of the convention. The unshrouded Article 5 convention isn't a Pandora's box at all, because there is no such thing as magic in a box for us to fear. There is only history, law, and reason to guide faithful Americans in tending their government. And precisely because there is no such thing as magic, we're going to need an effective tool to do the hard work of restoring our republic. It's time to dust off the tool the founders gave us in Article 5 and get started.
That was an outstanding video. And what I love about studying Convention of States or Article 5's history in particular is that the more you peel back, the more you take time to actually sit down and learn, you can understand and you can cut through all of the fear-mongering our opposition puts out there. When you sit down and you realize exactly what the intentions were of the founders and see how the history unfolds and why this method is safe, you can get beyond the fear and you can start to focus on, okay, well, how can we get a convention called and actually address these issues? And that's what I love about that. And that was an excellent, excellent video. So thank you, Producer G, for sharing that with everyone. Okay, so now let's hear about the latest COS news from across the country. And to do that, I'll turn it over to Jake Fay with COS Now.
Coming up on COS Now, a big victory in the Lone Star State. COS teams up with the NRA and a major milestone for Convention of States. All that and more on this week's episode of COS Now.
What do we want? When do we want it?
Hey guys, it's Jake Fay, staff writer with Convention of States. There's a lot going on in the movement, so let's get you up to date on all things COS. Last Monday, the Texas House of Representatives reaffirmed its support for Convention of States. The body briskly passed a clean version of the Article 5 application without an expiration date, with a favorable vote of 86 to 57. Here's lead sponsor for the resolution, Representative Cody Vassuts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this renews Texas's application for an Article 5 convention for term limits, balanced budget, and reining in the federal government. I move adoption. I think that this is a wonderful resolution to rein in the federal government, and by God, we ought to do it. Move adoption.
A vote from the Texas Senate is still needed for final passage. That could happen as early as this week. In a recent podcast, our friends at the Texas Public Policy Foundation talked about Convention of States.
I'm reminded of one of my favorite quotes, and I brought it with me. It's by one of my favorite economists. It's Milton Friedman, who said on an Article 5 convention, "The one device that can effectively bypass the Washington bureaucracy." And he goes on to say, in my opinion, the only feasible way of stopping tax increases is via a constitutional limitation on government spending and government taxes. We must not kid ourselves into thinking we are going to remedy it by the easy way of electing the right people into office. That will not work.
That's right. And Friedman adds later, he says, it's not electing the right people. It's about so informing and energizing the American people that even the wrong politician does the right policy.
And now for some sad news. Renowned author David Horowitz passed away on Tuesday, leaving behind a legacy of dedication to the principles of liberty. He was 86 years old. Horowitz defended the Convention of States movement against accusations from the unusual coalition of fringe right and far left critics. He concluded that the Article 5 convention process was safe and that those on the right who opposed it had been influenced by arguments that originated with far left academics.
The Convention of the States is made for the Trump era. It provides an opportunity to follow the example of our president's boldness, to leverage our power in behalf of the principles we hold dear. It is an opportunity to make America free again, to make America prosperous and strong again. It's an opportunity to make America great again. Don't miss it.
You can read his full article at conventionofstates.com. Now it's time for the final five. Number 1, for the first time ever, Convention of States had a major presence at the NRA's recent conference. Both organizations are strong supporters of the Second Amendment, making this a perfect match. COS volunteers collected over 500 petitions from attendees. Those petitions will be forwarded to their state legislators, urging them to vote yes on COS Action's Article 5 application. Number 2, COS recently surpassed 2.7 million petitions signed, a testimony to the dedication of the grassroots activists who work tirelessly to raise awareness about the solution as big as the problem. Number 3, the girl named Blake will be John's special guest for COS at Home. You can catch the broadcast live this Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time by visiting conventionofstates.com/at-home. Number 4, this past Thursday, the COS Live team reacted to previously unaired footage from a hearing of the Ohio House. You can watch playback of that event at conventionofstates.com/COS Live. And number 5, here are a few of my favorite photos from COS events around the country, including Vermont, Florida, Rhode Island, Louisiana, and Pennsylvania. What was your favorite piece of news from this week's recap? Let me know in the comments section below, and I'll see you at the same time next week of COS Now.
So much great stuff there. Thank you so much, Jake, for sharing all of that. First, I got to give you some important updates that happened today that we couldn't make it into that cut for COS Now. North Carolina has been extremely busy over the last couple of days. Our resolution was introduced in committee 2 days ago, I believe, or actually, no, it was yesterday it was introduced, as well as 34 ready legislation. It passed through committee, then passed through the Rules Committee, and then passed through the House floor today. So our COS resolution and 34 ready legislation are passed through the North Carolina House. It is on to the Senate, and we are really, really excited about what we can accomplish there in North Carolina. So congratulations to all of our grassroots for their hard work and getting things done in North Carolina. Just a great, great job and a huge victory for the team there. As for Texas, you heard about us passing HJR 98 through the House floor. That will remove the expiration date on our resolution. Well, earlier this week, we passed through the Senate State Affairs Committee by a vote of 8-3. And we are likely going to have a Senate floor vote this Friday, May 9th. We will have more details and be able to share more of that with you coming soon. So be sure to check out our social media accounts. We'll be sharing more about that, but it's likely going to be this Friday, May 9th for the Senate floor vote. By the way, if you are a Telepatriot volunteer, if you wouldn't mind, we could use your help in Texas. You can go to the Telepatriot portion of the COS Action app, select National Team, and help us in making some phone calls to some constituents of senators there in Texas. We greatly appreciate your assistance with that. I'll also mention that Louisiana, which happens to be the home state of our guest who will be joining us shortly, is supporting a number of F3 legislative bills this session. Remember, F3 is legislation that is non-COS in nature, but promotes freedom, federalism, or fundamental rights. Our Louisiana team has been very active with F3 legislation over the last couple of years. This year, two of the bills that they're going to be supporting, HB 371, which protects religious liberty, passed committee yesterday, and I believe it was sent to the House floor, and House Bill 377, which had a committee hearing earlier today, promotes medical freedom by allowing patients to refuse medical treatments under emergency use authorization from the FDA. So two really important bills that we're supporting there in Louisiana. And I know the Louisiana team is hoping to support some other legislation. So if you're out there in Louisiana, be sure to sign up, become an activist, join us, help us in responding to these calls to action. But just in summation, amazing work that's happening across the country. Congratulations to North Carolina, Texas, and all of our states for doing everything that they can to advance the COS mission. And thank you again, Jake, for that amazing update. And now we have the great pleasure of welcoming to the program the host of the Speakeasy podcast and author of Confessions of a Crappy Christian, Blake Guichet. Blake, it's an absolute pleasure to meet you. How are you doing this evening?
I'm great. I'm so excited to be here.
Thank you so much. Well, it's a pleasure to meet you and speak with you this evening. I'm sure many in our audience are not familiar with your work and may not know you apart from your interview with Mark on your podcast back in March. As we get things started tonight, please share with our audience your background and how you became the host of your own podcast.
Yeah, so I'm a Louisiana girl, born and bred, lived here my whole life. And in 2018, felt like there was space in the podcasting landscape for more honesty surrounding motherhood and mental health and walking out this Christian life. And so for my 30th birthday, I gave myself the gift of a podcast, and I had no idea what it was going to turn into. Just a few years later, it ended up becoming my full-time job, allowed me to leave my job and come home and be with my babies. And now I get to do full-time content creation on Instagram and on my podcast, do great conversations like this, meet people like Mark, who kind of has become like a friend now. And in the 2020-2021 era, just like a lot of people, I diverged into the political landscape. I had a lot of thoughts and opinions behind the scenes and just hadn't really gotten to a place where I was comfortable sharing those publicly. And I think everything that happened in 2020 just kind of pushed a lot of people to the point where it's like, I'm worse off not saying anything or trying to shed a light on what's going on. And so it's just been a wild ride ever since.
Well, that's quite a birthday gift to give yourself for your 30th birthday. But hats off to you, because not only did you give yourself a podcast, you've turned it into quite a successful podcast. But I'd like to talk a minute about what you were just mentioning, that you recently started to get into politics, or you got maybe not as recent, maybe it was about 5 years ago, because COVID was 5 years ago. But you recently rebranded your podcast, and you're titling it now the Speakeasy Podcast. And I think I heard you mention to one of your guests that you were surprised the name was available, and I was too. You know, that's a great nod to the Prohibition era, but I thought for sure the Speakeasy Podcast would be about a couple of guys talking about whiskey or something like that. So that's awesome. But I think I had heard when you were announcing this rebrand that you had intentionally avoided politics when you first started this podcast, but you mentioned that things changed. So tell us a little bit more about why you're starting to lean into the political conversation more.
Yeah, I have always I've always loved politics. I've always followed it. And when I started my platform, I was pretty adamant actually behind the scenes. I am not going to talk politics. It's too divisive. It's too complex. And I stuck with that for about 2 years, but then 2020 rolled around and COVID hits and 2 weeks to slow the spread. And then now we're in week 3. Now we're in week 5, 6. And that was my catalyst. What I remember, I can, go back to it vividly, getting on my Instagram stories and going, something's not right here. I don't feel like we're getting the full story. I don't feel like the response to what's happening is balanced. And I was stunned. I mean, literally just a couple of Instagram stories. I was stunned by it. Like my inbox was just flooded with other people who felt the same and were really thankful that somebody had the bravery, I guess, to say it, to go just ask the question. I wasn't even coming to the table going, this is what I think is happening. I was saying something's not right. And that really blew the door open. And then 2021 hits and we have mandated vaccines. And that was when I really went kind of 10 toes down. That really heavily impacted my immediate family. Lots of intimate members that I love were really threatened with having to lose their entire livelihood and careers that they had built over years over this. And I went real hard on that. And then it just was a snowball from there. And I have the background of loving all of that and keeping up with it and being able to, I think sometimes I'm able to make these really complex things, bring them down to more layman's terms and make them make sense for people. And so, and I mean, right behind 2021, the campaigns basically start. And so then I'm kind of covering that. And so it's just kind of been this snowball effect since 2020.
Absolutely. And you mentioned that you're in Louisiana, so I figured I right along with what you're talking about with COVID and the vaccines that came out after that, our Louisiana team right now is supporting a bill in your legislature called House Bill 377. And what that would do is that would require healthcare providers to inform patients with a written and verbal notice that they may refuse a drug covered under the FDA's emergency use authorization. So those COVID vaccines and everything, people would be given the ability, and healthcare providers would have to let them know that they could refuse those types of treatments. And that's just a little bit about what we do with Convention of States. With some of the states that have already passed our resolution, we start to look at legislation in states that promote freedom and protect our rights. So just figured I'd mention that to you in case you wanted to take a look at that.
Yeah, we've got a lot going on. Once we got Landry in office, things started to really kind of swing in our favor.
Absolutely. So when you first debuted your podcast, you called it Confessions of a Crappy Christian, and that's also the title of your book. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about the book and what is a crappy Christian?
Yeah, so the verses that talk about our God's power being made perfect in our weakness, and that his power will shine even more through just our vulnerability, was where the catalyst for the podcast began. And so that was and it was cheeky and people were drawn to it, and it was a good marketing ploy that I'm not going to try to show up perfectly here, because I'm not. And especially back then, the podcasting landscape in the Christian realm has changed pretty significantly. We're seeing a lot more of that vulnerability and people being honest. But back then, honestly, it was pretty flowery and perfect and buttoned up. And I just needed something different. And so I felt the call from God to make it. And so that was where the title came from, was the tagline at the opening was like, this is a place where you and all of your crap are welcome. Like nobody's doing this perfectly, and we need a space to show up and talk about those things. And then a few years into the podcast, I had a publishing house reach out and asked me to write a book. And it was funny. I actually assumed that they would not want to use the title of the podcast for the title of the book. And so I pitched it with a different title, and they came back and were like, wait, why is this not titled this way? It's, already established and it's so catchy. And so the book is essentially all of these things that I've walked through and lessons that I've learned that have dismantled this idea that I have to be perfect to show up at, the feet of Jesus, and that he wants you with all of your stuff and all of your brokenness and all of the lessons that over the years God's taught me of all those things.
So if there was one thing, if you could boil it down to one thing that you would like people to take away from reading your book, what would that one thing be?
That it's not just you. It's literally never just you. And I think that's one of the most isolating and powerful messages that the enemy tells believers is you're the only one, you're weird, there's something inherently wrong or broken with you and your struggles. And I kind of basically just wrote this book that was like, bleh. It's not just you. It's all of us. It's me too. And here's how God uses it. Here's how he, brings beauty for ashes. And that if you don't isolate in those struggles, God can and will use them for good.
Excellent. And it's funny, as I was listening to you say that, I was thinking back to what you were just saying a few minutes ago, where it was during COVID that things kind of blew up for you and you started to get into politics a little bit more. And at that time, people were feeling like they were by themselves and they were alone. And yet here your book is letting them know, hey, you are not alone. You don't have to feel like you're out there by yourself. In fact, you have the Lord right there walking step by step with you. So I'm curious, Blake, how would you say your Christian faith impacts your political ideology?
I mean, it has to, right? I would say that all of the beliefs that I have politically can stand on their own. They can stand on their own historically, scientifically, biologically. But yes, absolutely, the belief that God is a good creator and that he created order and that he wants what's best for his kids also informs all of those beliefs. I feel like it just strengthens beliefs that I know could stand on their own without that. But I also think it gives me a level of conviction and passion that I may not have otherwise if my beliefs weren't also backed by a very real relationship with a very real creator, right? That this is about more than just me and even just my kids. This is about generations to come. And we can see in scripture and in history how that turns out. And so I think it empowers my ability and my desire to show up in that way and speak into those things, and also makes it easier to talk about all of those things because my identity isn't in them, right? I think a lot of these political conversations, right and left, people's identities have become completely saturated in their political standing. And then when somebody comes for you, or comes for your beliefs, it feels like they're coming for you. And so I think separating that makes it a lot easier to enter that realm, because that's a crazy arena. People are wild and unhinged and say really crazy things. But if like you're rooted in Christ and that's where your identity is, then it's kind of like, okay, you can say whatever you want.
Yeah, it definitely grounds you and keeps you level-headed despite all of the slings and arrows that you deal with in everyday life.
Yeah.
That's great. So part of how we got to know about you is that we have some Speak Easy podcast fans on our staff. And I would say probably the number one fan on our staff of yours is Chelsea McGee in our operations department. Now, she insisted that I ask you about Caroline Leavitt sharing a post of yours about immigration. What did the president's press secretary share exactly?
So it wasn't about immigration. It was about the SAVE Act.
The SAVE Act.
She had a really killer moment in one of her press conferences where, I mean, I don't like, if you're not chronically online, you may not have seen it, but everybody was all in this uproar that married women weren't going to be able to vote if the SAVE Act passes. And I've been out here trying to beat the drum that that's not true. And so she got up there and really, like, I mean, you know how she is. She just got up there and cut through it. And it was so good and succinct and perfect. And so I just grabbed that and made it a reel. And Caroline follows me. We followed each other before she became press secretary, because I just loved her. Like, I've loved her since she got kicked off of CNN a couple of years ago. And she shared it on her stories, and it was very exciting. All of my people were like, oh my gosh. So that was fun.
Yeah, that's awesome. Caroline Levitt also was an endorser, or is an endorser of Convention of States. So we were very excited to see her elevated to that position there. And it's funny that it was the SAVE Act. I wish I'd written that down correctly. I'm sure Chelsea told me the right thing and I got it wrong. But the SAVE Act is actually something that Convention of States supported last year. We got behind it to try and get it passed in the House and in the Senate. Obviously, we got it through the House. We weren't able to get it through the Senate. Hopefully, we'll be able to get this across the finish line in the Senate. But I know it's a major challenge to do that. But again, that's just another example of what we try to do with Convention of States, is we try to support some of these things that may not necessarily be just about Article 5. And we say that we're more than a convention, and the SAVE Act was definitely one of those. So with this change that you've had over the last couple of years to lean more into political discussions, our staff was obviously able to connect with you and schedule that interview with Mark earlier this year. And folks, if you haven't listened to that, definitely check out the Speakeasy podcast, listen to Mark and Blake's discussion. It was really a great conversation. But prior to your interaction with us, or the interview with Mark, had you heard about the convention process in Article 5?
I had no idea. That's why I was so excited to interview Mark. So I was like, once so we tell the story on the podcast, but I had a bunch of people in my DMs and emails asking me to have Mark on the show. They're like, it's so aligned. And he had people in his corner saying, you need to get on Blake's podcast. And so before we could even pitch him, he pitched us. And once I started looking into everything he was doing, I sent an email and told him, I normally block an hour, but we're probably going to need longer than that, because I am so intrigued and have so many questions. So I had no idea. I got to kind of learn it firsthand from the man himself.
That's awesome. So now that you've learned more about Article 5 and you've learned about what we're trying to accomplish with Convention of States, would you say, or what would you say is perhaps the most exciting aspect of what we're doing and why you've become a Convention of States supporter?
Well, I think it's really at the bottom of what a lot of people believe in this political climate, and it's that the most power we can give to the people possible, the better things are going to get for everybody. And this is just like I think that can feel really abstract to people, especially if they aren't very politically plugged in or inclined. And so finding out that there's something that is a pipeline, is a direct way that we can actually make an impact through our elected representatives is exciting and invigorating, and goes, oh, wait, this is a system that is supposed to work for us and actually can work. And so I think that makes it really easy to buy in that this is something that our founders knew we would need. And it's like, all right, now we need it. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And I mentioned earlier in the program that, and what I just said a few minutes ago is that we're more than a convention, because our goal is to get to a convention to propose amendments to the Constitution, but our mission statement is to reestablish a culture of self-governance, because the first three words of the Constitution are "we the people." And so if we're not the ones that are doing what is necessary to make sure that we are a check on our federal officials and that we're doing everything we can to bring the power back to the states, which the states that are sovereign in our country, then we're failing. And we have allowed the government to become what it has become because we've let them do that, right? We turn the keys of the car over to them. And so what we're trying to do is we're obviously trying to get to convention to reduce the size and scope of the federal government, bring it back to what the founders had intended. but we're also trying to get everyone to understand that, hey, we have a responsibility as an American citizen to do what is necessary to protect the freedoms that we have been granted by the founders and really by God. The everything that's outlined in the Declaration of Independence, we're the ones who are the keepers of that, and we have to make sure that we are engaged.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't have said that any better.
So one last question for you from everything that I've gotten from learning about you and listening to your podcast, you're very much a doer, and you're encouraging people to stay engaged. So what, if anything, what kind of message would you have for people that may be on the fence, not sure if they really want to get involved in politics, or perhaps even Christians that say, you know what, I don't know that this is something that we should be talking about, or maybe certainly not in church. What advice would you have for them?
Typically, because I get that a lot, and my response is always, I fully believe that our culture and country are in the condition that they are today because Christians have let themselves be sidelined. The church allowed culture and the world to push us off to the sides, and we went willingly. Push maybe is even an aggressive word to use there. And now, and thankfully, the ship seems to be righting itself to some degree, but there's a lot of work to be done because we, who have direct connection to the creator of all things, that as a good and faithful father, said, oh, that's political, and we backed out of issues that are deeply biblical. They are deeply biblical. Everything that you voted for, if you voted for Trump because it was going so sideways, those are biblical theological issues. And so if you believe that you don't have a place in the political realm, I encourage you to open your Bible and see person after person that are in the hall of faith that were involved politically in some form or fashion. And if it feels super overwhelming to you, get started on a local level. This is a direct pipeline, and getting involved on the local level is actually how you can make sometimes an even greater impact than trying to go all the way to the top from the get.
Yeah, I think that last comment was really important because, whether it's in your church or through local government, like your school board or your town council, those are actually areas where votes are even closer. The margin of victory is very, very slim. So you can have a major impact on that. And not only that, you could possibly be somebody that runs for one of those school board positions or town council positions and really make an impact within your community, even though it doesn't seem like it's got the glamour of a federal position or what have you. Really starting at the local level, you can have a bigger impact than perhaps your local congressman or United States senator.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you're going to make a greater impact for your family, most likely, on those smaller local levels and change things there. And then let God take it from there. Who knows where you'll go.
Excellent. Well, I said that was going to be the last question. I lied. I forgot. I have one other question for you. I've heard that you're a homeschool mom. Tell us a little bit more about that. Why did you decide to go the homeschool route?
Yeah. So I went from I could never homeschool mom to now I love it. And it's one of the things that I talk about on my platform and my podcast pretty often. And it was a long process. So I've mentioned 2020 a couple of times now. 2020 was a catalyst for a lot of things in our lives. And one of those things was we got all this time together as a family, and we got kind of addicted to it, right? We just loved the slower pace and being together. And so that was kind of planted a seed, but it took us years to move our life around to get to a point where that was even something that was viable. And honestly, I could fill a multi-hour podcast with the reasons, but I think at the end of the day, it really was, we wanted more time with our kids, and we wanted to be the greatest influence in our children's lives. And that requires being the ones that are in front of your kids all the time. And so we just made the move. We're finishing up our first year right now. And it's hard. It's one of the hardest things we've ever done, but so worth it. We've loved it so much.
Yeah, that's an amazing sacrifice to be willing to do that with your kids. I don't think people fully understand what that might be like because, so many people are just The sad thing, I think, with education in general is I think a lot of people have looked at it as glorified daycare. And one of the beauties of 2020, you talked about being home with your kids, but I also think it opened a lot of people's eyes to exactly what it is that the public schools are teaching our children. And people were horrified by that. And I think we've seen a large movement to school choice and education savings accounts in a number of states because of that. Now, I'm curious, as a homeschool mom, there's actually been some in the homeschool community that have been a little concerned about education savings accounts and school choice. Where do you come down on it? How do you feel about the school choice movement that's really caught fire over the last couple of years?
I think it's one of those dual-edged swords where I can see where the benefits are for the parents that are utilizing the public or even private system, but I can also see how some of those things are going to potentially infringe on the freedoms that homeschool families enjoy in a lot of states. And obviously all of the states function on this sliding scale of oversight and control for homeschool families. But I think a lot of the concern is as those things continue, which are good, like I want that for people, but they come at a cost. And I think that's going to be one of those things that we're just going to watch unfold. It's going to be really defining for our generation of parents.
Yeah, without question. And I think what it really underscores is why we need to be engaged, whether it's at the local level on up. We have to be paying attention to what's going on. We have to be a part of the conversation and bringing our values as Christians into the forefront, not hide behind it. I think a lot of people feel like, well, if I'm a Christian, I'm not really supposed to say that. I'm not really supposed to talk about the Bible. That's not true. We need to be salt and light, as Jesus told us, and we need to make sure that we're out there in the public square having these conversations and debating these issues and not necessarily vilifying people if they come down on the other side of the spectrum or have a difference with us on an important issue. As long as everyone's coming from it with good faith, we should be able to agree to disagree.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you have to vilify the other side, it means you can't make your point quite as succinctly as you think you can. And there's plenty to be said without having to kind of turn to that debate method.
Amen. Well, Blake, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for being a supporter of Convention of States. Thank you for taking the time this evening to come on COS at Home. I'm glad we had the opportunity to return the favor. So glad that Mark was able to connect with you and be on your podcast. For folks who would like to follow your work or learn a little bit more about you, where would they go?
Yeah, I'm mostly on Instagram. It's probably where I'm the most active. It's just the girl named Blake. And then that's also the URL of my website. And you can kind of find everything from there as well.
Excellent. Well, God bless you, Blake, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Take care. Well, that was a great conversation. And folks, I do encourage you, check out Blake's work. She's been doing an amazing job, and listening to some of her podcasts as I was preparing for this interview, I really enjoyed her conversations and her line of thought. So I encourage you to check it out, and be sure to check out Confessions of a Crappy Christian, wherever books are sold. Okay, let's go ahead and move to Action at Home. All right, so tonight, the action that we're sharing with you is one we've discussed before, and it's super simple for anyone that you can do. You can literally do it right now from the comfort of your own home in front of your computer. We want to reintroduce you to the new Social Media Warrior program, and to do that, we're going to first hear from Mark Meckler.
Did you know that one click a day can keep tyranny away? Let me explain to you what I mean. Did you know that most legislators manage their own social media accounts? Getting halfway to calling a convention of states, and beyond that, you can actually make a big difference with our new project where you can be the person that does that one click a day and keeps tyranny away. The way it works is you're going to participate in daily missions. It won't take you more than a couple of minutes, and you can go in and you can comment on the exciting content, the new content that's on our Facebook and our X accounts. This is part of a strategic plan that we've already seen the benefits from. In fact, in Montana, we believe that we watched several votes flip in our direction that we're pretty sure were already no votes, but they got a bunch of attention. They got a bunch of tags in social media, saw all the people paying attention, and they flipped our direction. So the content that you're going to engage with, the kind of stuff we're going to ask you to click on and comment on and then tag legislators on, It could be something about Article 5, why it matters. Might be a big endorsement from us, like our endorsement by Pete Hegseth or Mark Levin or Caroline Levitt. It's going to be something that we believe if legislators look at, it's going to have influence on them. And you're going to be the person that makes that influence happen. This is the digital battlefield, and I think this is where we help win the hearts and minds of our representatives. It's the battlefield of today, and it's all part of our mission to build an engaged army of self-governing grassroots activists. Don't forget, 1 click a day keeps tyranny away, and you can do that by going to conventionofstates.com/social. That's conventionofstates.com/social to check out the daily mission. Do it every day. There's a new mission every weekday morning.
Groovy music there. I love it. 1 click a day keeps tyranny away. So, folks, you want to make sure you can go to conventionofstates.com/social. Daily missions are found there. You mentioned, Mark was talking about some of the impact that we can have and how easy and simple it is. You've got a social media account. You're on Facebook. You're on X. You can have a big impact on that. And we're even seeing it. There are a lot of legislators that we thought may not be on the fence or were undecided that kind of were convinced through some of these posts and voted for our resolution. We saw that in a couple of states, and it can have a major impact on them. So please join us, help us out, help us make some of these posts go viral by going to conventionofstates.com/social. Every morning, we're going to have something new out there, and we're going to be sharing some more things. Even as we get into the summer and some of the legislative sessions die down, there's still going to be more things that we're going to be sharing and doing, because we want to create this habit for everyone so that this way we can really have a major impact and get the word out for Convention of States. So again, conventionofstates.com/social. 1 click a day keeps tyranny away. Okay, let's go ahead and check the Minutemen Mailbag. Okay, so for tonight's program, we're taking a little bit of a different approach to the Minutemen Mailbag. Instead of you asking the question of me and then me providing an answer to you, we decided instead to bring a question to you and then share some of your responses here on the show this evening. So the question that we asked of all of you was, will cutting the size of the Department of Education help or hurt our kids' education, and why? And I think this is a great question that we happened to ask when we had Blake on here and we were talking about homeschooling and school choice. So the first question or first response that we got is from Catherine Hadrick. And Catherine wrote in and said, cities and towns and states and parents know better how to educate their kids. We don't need a federal Department of Education or government unions. There should be no underserved neighborhoods. I absolutely agree with that. And it really, each one of our states, there's a culture that goes within the state, right? I mean, think about it. If you've been to Florida, if you live here in Florida like I do, and you've been to New Jersey, where I'm originally from, yeah, even though there are a number of people from New Jersey that have moved down to Florida and New York, Florida is still very different from New Jersey, right? The culture is just vastly different. Even more so when you start to think about Texas or you start to think about states like Iowa or Wyoming, right? So why should a federal government have a one-size-fits-all approach to education and be impacting us? As Catherine was pointing out, the states know best. And I think that's exactly right. The next response that we have is from Anne-Marie Wickman. And Anne-Marie said, cut it. Actually disband it entirely. By disbanding it, people will be accountable to be informed on who's running for local elections, including school board elections. And that's another great point from Anne-Marie. And it reminds me of what David Barton shared with us one time. I think he shared the story of there being someone out west in a rural area where they were running for school board, and they got so busy that day that they actually didn't make it to the polls to vote for themselves. And had they done that, they would have pushed their race to a runoff, or at the very least, maybe they would have won because they lost by one vote, right? One vote they lost by their school board race. And that happens across the country. So all the more reason why we need to be focused on these school board elections and not paying attention to what goes on in Washington, D.C., you get rid of that Department of Education. People are going to be focused even more on these local races, which I think is a good thing. Next, we've got John McDonald, and John said, since the Department of Education was established in 1979, the outcome for public education has been in continual decline. What further evidence is needed? Not sure I could say it better than that, John. That was very well said. Yes, if the evidence says that things are getting worse, at the very least, you should be acting, learning, and adjusting. And I think the evidence is, there's been a preponderance of evidence that it's clear the Department of Education is not improving our education, and it's time to do away with it. Last one we have is from Paul Onder. Paul wrote in and said, all public schools are controlled by the state and local governments. What does the federal government have to do with funding state schools? Right. Again, what we were just saying just a minute ago, these states are very different, and they all have their own departments of education. Every single state in the country, to my knowledge, has a Department of Education, and they're capable of handling it. Not only do you have a state Department of Education, you've also got, obviously, your local school boards. Why do we need a federal government telling us with a one-size-fits-all agenda what we should be doing? And furthermore, that's not really what they use the Department of Education for anymore anyway. Yes, they do have certain programs that they push on you, but it's really a way of putting pressure on states to comply with things that may not be agreed upon by the country in general, but certainly by the majority of people in their states. And if not, then they will take away federal funding. So really, the Department of Education is just using itself as a cudgel over states to adopt things that may not align with their values, just so that this way the money keeps rolling in. And I just think we need to cut that spigot. Let's end that. Let's get rid of the Department of Education. And the only way to do that, right? Even President Trump with Secretary McMahon, they're making a lot of steps to reduce the size of the Department of Education. They're cutting that size. But if you wanted to end it entirely, Congress would have to do that. Congress has been struggling to do just about anything these days, including enacting some of the positive reforms that we have seen from the Trump administration and codifying that into law. The real way, the best way for us to remove the Department of Education, as well as other large, big government organizations and departments, is through an Article 5 convention. And that's why we need to see the Convention of States resolution adopted in 34 states so we can get that convention called and start proposing some amendments. So I'm going to say, don't forget, go to conventionofstates.com/act, sign up, become a volunteer, join your team within your state to help us make this a reality. Excellent responses. A great question that we put out there. I want to thank everyone for responding to that. And if you would like to be able to respond to those, you can go to conventionofstates.com/mailbag. That's where we're going to have the question posted. I'm not sure if we've got the one up yet for June, but we'll definitely be updating our social media accounts so that everyone can check that out and then respond. And we hope to be able to read your response on the air next month. Okay, let's go ahead and move to COS Voices. All right. So when we, again, I feel like I'm repeating myself here, but again, we're looking at this segment a little bit differently. And when we first created this segment, you may recall from a year or so ago, when we first created it, what we had in mind was giving some elevator pitches that our grassroots recorded, right? We wanted to hear you to hear how they responded to one of the top questions we've got, which is, how do I tell people about Convention of States, but doing so succinctly? Well, over the last few programs, we started to share our activists giving testimonies before legislative committees because we felt that was important. You need to see exactly what our grassroots activists can do when they're out there in front of the legislators. The lights are on and people are listening to them about why it's so important that we see an Article 5 convention called. Well, tonight, we're again going to go in a little bit of a different direction. We're going to give you an opportunity to hear from one of our newest endorsers as to why they believe in Convention of States. So tonight, you're going to have a chance to hear from Caroline Levitt.
When I was in Washington, D.C., I saw how corrupt the swamp really is. Corrupt career politicians on both sides of the aisle are really using the system to their advantage for their own power. them. So that's what really compelled me to step up and do something about that. That's why I'm a huge supporter of term limits, and it's also why I'm a supporter of the Convention of States, because that project, that movement, and as laid out in Article 5 of our Constitution, aligns with the principles that I believe. We need a government for the people, by the people, and get the federal government out of our everyday lives. The heavy hand of the feds is hurting our businesses, our economy, our education system. I'm a strong supporter of the Constitution and always will be. So thank you and God bless.
Love that last line there. I'm a strong supporter of the Constitution and always will be. I think a lot of people forget, especially our opponents, or they want you to forget, that Article 5 is part of the Constitution. And as Cody Vasut, our champion in Texas in the House there, pointed out, either you love the Constitution or you don't love the Constitution. Article 5 is part of that Constitution, both methods to amending the Constitution. And that's part of it. And I love that Caroline said, I'm a supporter of the Constitution, and therefore I'm a supporter of Article 5 and Convention of States. So thank you so much, Caroline, for your support and for all of your service to our great country. Okay, folks, we've reached the conclusion of our program. And just a reminder, all of the COS at Home shows are aired live on the first Wednesday of every month at 8 o'clock Eastern Time. The next show will be on Wednesday, June 4th at 8 p.m. Eastern. But we're not quite ready to share exactly who the guest or guests, that might be a hint for you, will be for that program. However, I'm not teasing you, but I am going to tell you that for sure you're not going to want to miss this, because it is going to be an awesome program, and I'm really excited for what we have in store, but we're just not ready to share exactly what that is just yet. So come on back, join us Wednesday, June 4th, 8 o'clock Eastern for COS at Home. And ladies and gentlemen, as always, this has been a lot of fun. I love coming on here and talking with you and bringing Convention of States to you in the comfort of your own home. Thank you for being here tonight. I hope you enjoyed the show and that it was helpful and enlightening to you. Thanks again to our new friend, Blake Guichet, for joining us tonight. The podcast is the Speak Easy podcast, so be sure to check her out. And as always, a huge thanks to the legend Producer G for all of the hard work that he puts in behind the scenes to help us bring this important information to you every month. But the greatest thanks of all, as I say every month, goes to each and every one of you in our audience in the Convention of States Army for all of your continued support of the movement and your support of Article 5. It's important to remember, folks, Blake was talking, sometimes it feels like we're alone or we're isolated, or that there are just so many things that are going on within the country. It can be demoralizing. And even now with President Trump and a lot of the things that we're excited about, we're still not seeing everything accomplished, right? We're still not seeing Congress get moving, and it can be frustrating and even somewhat demoralizing at times. We have to remember that despite all of the problems, despite the challenges that we face as a nation, it's you and I, we the people, that are the solution. And so we need to stay engaged and be active and continue to work every single day. Thank you again for being here tonight. I appreciate each and every one of you. Congratulations again to North Carolina. Congratulations, and keep it going, Texas. God bless each and every one of you. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you in June.